to us about advanced batteries and electrochemical energy storage more generally. Just two logistical points. Please turn your cell phones off so that it doesn't cause interference. And afterward, when we have a Q&A, please wait until a microphone is given to you because we are videotaping. And so we like to make sure we can record for posterity your insightful questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Mark Watson from the Woodrow Wilson School, who is an old friend and colleague of our distinguished speaker today, who will tell us a little bit of background about our speaker. Mark.
So I've been given the honor of introducing Jim. For those of you that are economists, you don't need an introduction. He doesn't need an introduction, obviously, everyone knows him. For those of you that aren't economists, let me just say a few things about Jim. Well, Jim's a professor at UCSD, which is a fine place. They have an ocean close, the right ocean. Jim wears a lot of hats as an economist and is known for lots of things. He's made significant contributions to econometrics and macroeconomics. Perhaps the most well-known is what in economics we call the Hamilton-Markov switching model, which is a model used to do lots of things, but in particular to date business cycles and tell us how recessions are different than expansions. To PhD students in economics, Jim is known. Every PhD student in economics since 1994 has worked through this thick book called Time Series Analysis that Jim wrote and has been selling briskly at Princeton University Press since 1994. Today, we're not going to hear about econometrics, and we're not going to hear about macroeconomics. Instead, we're going to hear about another one of Jim's loves, which is energy and oil prices. Jim has been studying this since his PhD thesis, in which he did some work that everyone questions until they looked at it carefully, which is the relationship between oil prices and recessions in the United States. And Jim has continued this work thinking about energy more generally throughout his career. So we look forward to hearing what he has to say today.
Thank you very much, Mark. Is the volume okay in the back? Everybody here? Okay, good. Let me begin by just reminding you some of the standard economic notions about exhaustible resources. A resource like oil, which when you take it out of the ground and burn it, you can't use it next year. And about the basic question of should we be using a resource like that, using up a resource, or should we be saving it for the future generations? Well, one way you can get a handle on that question is to say, well, gee, I might consider doing one of two things. I would consider taking an extra barrel of oil today, burning it, using it to produce some more productive capital, so I could use that capital to have more stuff for the future. Or maybe I should just leave the oil in the ground so it'll be there, be available for us to use in the future. Which of those two things would you want to do? Well, if you calculated what you'd have in the future if you invested in productive capital from the oil you produce today, with what the value of that resource would be for the future, if the marginal benefit of for the future generation of producing it today, having capital for the future, were greater than that of the oil itself in the future, you'd want to be using up the oil today. And on the other hand, if the value to the future is higher of the oil itself, then anything you could make with the oil today, you could pass along to future generations, then you'd want to be saving the resource. And optimality from the social perspective, from the view of society overall, would say you want to be at the point where the marginal benefit of either one of these strategies is exactly the same. And then it turns out that under certain ideal assumptions, a competitive equilibrium, that would be the outcome if you just left the market to itself. And the way this argument goes is, well, if I'm the owner of this resource, I could consider taking the oil out today. I could use the the proceeds, invest them at the rate of interest to get that productive capital, and that would be one way I could get a return. Or I could leave the oil in the ground, and if the price of the oil rises, in particular if the price relative to the marginal extraction cost rises at the rate of interest, I would be just indifferent between the two. So it's a classical argument due to hoteling that says under some conditions the private market on itself would do exactly the optimal thing in terms of this allocative question, should we use a resource today or save it for the future? It's a very elegant theory, but it seems to have nothing to do with the facts. Here is a plot of the real price of oil, the price of oil adjusted for inflation, going back to 1860 when the industry began. And of course, you see the price of oil is extremely volatile, but even always has been. Even abstracting from that, there is, if anything, a downward trend in the real price of oil for the 19th century and most of the 20th century. There was this episode in the 1970s when the real price was going up very rapidly, and a resurrection of interest in this theory of hoteling, which was actually developed in the 1930s, a resurrection of interest in, well, maybe we're seeing that, that theory verified, but then the price collapsed, and in the 1990s, it was for a while below the price, what it had been in 1920, and then the last decade, we're seeing the price go up again, and again, perhaps a renewed interest in this. But whatever you see in that graph, it does not seem to be the price minus the marginal extraction cost rising over time at the rate of interest. So what can you do to try to salvage the theory? Well, a couple of possibilities. One, you could say, well, sure, oil is an exhaustible resource. Everybody has to agree with that. There's a finite amount on the planet. Once we burn it, it's burned. You can't use that barrel again. But maybe there is so much of the stuff that exhaustion is so far off into the future, once you discount that future, it really makes no difference today, and that historically the price of oil has always been just like any other commodity. There's none of this, this scarcity rent accumulating over time. Or another possibility is that, well, there's been technological progress, and there are various ways that argument can go. Maybe that would lower the marginal production cost over time, or maybe unanticipated new discoveries. That can give you a framework in which the real price of oil might fall, at least for a period, until it eventually begins to rise. And some brave people have tried to make that kind of story fit the facts as well. But I'd like to begin with just some comments on exactly what the nature of that technological progress in the oil industry has been. So this is a diagram of one of the methods you might have used to try to drill for oil in the beginning. This is known as the spring pole method. And there are three sturdy guys here. There's a heavy iron bit here at the end of the rope. These guys would kick that down so that it pounds into the rock down there underneath. And then the spring action from the pole would lift it up, kick it down again, raise it up, and then they'd maybe move this out, and this guy here would lower a bucket down into the hole and take some of the debris out. You'd lengthen the rope a little bit and go at it, and that's one way you can drill for oil. Well, we made a lot of progress since then. We've got rotary drilling where there's fluid that continuously brings the debris up, wonderful advances in casement technology. We have a heck of a lot better idea where we're going to find oil. Secondary and tertiary recovery methods where we inject water or water or gas around underneath the reservoir to try to get a little more oil up where we can access it. The horizontal drilling and fracturing methods that I'll talk a little bit about. Amazing technological advances in the last century and a half. But here's a picture that I find fascinating. This is a graph of the annual production of oil from the state where it began, Pennsylvania. Annual production from Pennsylvania from 1859 through 2011. Actually, New York is thrown in there because for the very early data, the two states are together. And what I call your attention to is that number peaked. Peak production from Pennsylvania came in 1891, 120 years ago. There was this episode here in the 1930s, when the secondary recovery methods I was talking about became applied, they went back to some of those old fields, got some more oil out of them, but never got production back up to where it had been in 1891. And today, 2011, with all the wonderful advances in technology we've made, production is about 1/8 what it was in 1891, and yet the real price of oil is 5 times as great as it was in 1891. And I call attention to this fact because a lot of economists tend to think in terms of, well, as technology improves, we're going to get better and better. That's, of course, true. They think as the price goes up, there's more and more incentive to try to get the stuff. And that's true as well. But my observation is that that's not limitless in terms of what it can do. And just to make an analogy, it's certainly correct. If you have better technology and more resources, you can maybe prolong your life. But you're not going to live forever, no matter how much money you spend, or no matter how clever your doctor is. And so I want to emphasize, I'm not saying we're running out of oil. Pennsylvania's been producing oil for a century and a half. It'll probably produce oil for the next century and a half. That's not the question. I'm not talking about running out of oil. I'm asking, does a technology exist that would enable us today, this year, to produce as much oil from Pennsylvania as we did in 1891? And I want to submit to you that maybe the answer to that question is no. Regardless, if there is such a technology, we haven't found it for 120 years. And today, with all our amazing advances, we're getting about as much oil out of that state as those sturdy farmers did with their spring pole right after the Civil War. Now, you probably know that wasn't the end of the oil industry. So it turned out that as oil production from Pennsylvania was falling, people were discovering, hey, there's oil in Ohio. There's oil in West Virginia. So this top graph is the one I just showed you, Pennsylvania with a little from New York thrown in. Here's oil from Ohio. So Ohio production is going up even after Pennsylvania production is going down. Ohio production peaking in 1896. And after that's coming down, West Virginia production is still going up. West Virginia not peaking until 1900. And if you add those three together, basically those states pretty much were most of U.S. production from the 19th century. If you were to just look at a plot of U.S. production of oil, you'd say, oh, it keeps going up and up every year. And you might say, that's because our technology is getting better and better every year. Well, it's true. Technology was getting better and better every year, but that's not really the reason. The reason is we were going to new geographic areas, new fields. And that was really more important than the technology, as impressive as the technology itself was. Well, you probably know that wasn't the end of the oil industry either, because it turned out there were other oil fields in the central United States, for example, Illinois, which I've grouped together with Indiana here. And let me call your attention to the fact this is on a different scale from the others. All of these states turned out to be much better places to get oil than Appalachia ever was. But they all peaked. So Illinois, Indiana reached their peak in 1940. Kansas, Nebraska in 1957. The Four Corner states in the southwest U.S., 1960. Wyoming, which is here in the last graph, in 1970. And again, so overall U.S. production keeps going up and up because we're going to new, and it turns out better places to get oil. The really good places, the four biggest states, which account for something like 70% of all U.S. production, were California, which we've got on the top, Oklahoma, Texas, and then Louisiana. This graph of Louisiana includes the Gulf of Mexico, a very big source today. Oklahoma reaches peak in 1927. Today, Oklahoma is producing a little less than a third of what it did then. Texas reached its peak in 1972, less than half of what they're today producing less than half of what they did. California peaked in 1985. Louisiana, even including the Gulf of Mexico, truly amazing technology. Here you're talking about going through miles of rock, a mile under the water. You try and doing that with your guys kicking the spring pole down. It's tough going. Amazing things we're doing to try to get this oil, but still substantially below the peak. And then the two most recent big plays Alaska, which peaked in 1988, and North Dakota, which I've grouped here with Montana in this graph. That's the one state or pair of states where you're actually seeing all-time highs for U.S. production. And this, of course, is the horizontal drilling and fracturing technology, which has brought some formations there into play that are substantial advances. And there's similar plays in many other parts of the U.S. Now, in terms of this graph, so these are on the same scale, these two. Alaska is drawn on the same scale as North Dakota. And some people are very excited that North Dakota has now passed Alaska. It's partly because Alaska is just a shadow of its former self. But North Dakota is definitely on its way up. And I'll comment on some of the latest figures of that. But first, let me just give you the broad summary of all of this. This is like those first three. So this is total U.S. production. With each of the various states here, you can see Texas, that was a really big story. Louisiana, another. And so if you looked at just total U.S. production, you would say, gee, it just keeps going up and up from 1859 up to 1970. But the story behind that is we were moving to new fields and better fields. Texas was a better place than Indiana. Indiana was a better place than Pennsylvania. It's that geographic expansion that's the primary factor in that tendency to go up and up. Now, Alaska is this dark green. That was a supergiant field, a major field. Bumped production back up for a while, though not to where it was at the peak. And then here we are, up through 2011. You can see a little bit move back up. That's from these shale oil formations that people are talking about. Now, maybe you saw last week the IEA came out with a new assessment saying, with what were reported in the press as very optimistic predictions for where we'd be by 2020. And what they basically said was that we'd be back above 10 million barrels a day of U.S. production by 2020. That would put us, this isn't in barrels per day, this is in barrels per year, that would put us back about where we were in 1985. Still below the all-time peak, but those new IEA projections that everybody's kind of talking about as if they're the greatest news are not that we'd get back to where we were in 1970. And furthermore, that's a temporary thing. Their projection is that after 2020, those fields would go back into decline. I should also mention that those IEA projections include natural gas liquids, which are produced from come originally from natural gas. They isolate out some denser hydrocarbons from that. 80% of that is either ethane or propane, which you can't use to drive your car. You don't drive your car with the vast majority of the stuff that's counted as natural gas liquids. Anyway, they're adding that in. They're adding natural gas liquids in to come up with that 10 million barrels a day. I don't know their breakdown for 2020. I can tell you that in 2011, the natural gas liquids are something like 28% of that U.S. total. So really, in terms, if you were comparing apples to apples, and you took their prediction, you'd say, no, we're not even going to get back to 1985 with this horizontal drilling. Now, so again, getting back to this issue of incentives and technological advance, just put these in perspective. What this graph is showing is that between 1900 and 1960, for example, U.S. production of crude oil increased by a factor of 55. Phenomenal increases in production. And over that period, the real price fell by a third. On the other hand, since 1970, production is down 41%, but the real price has increased by a factor of 8. Lots better technology, lots more incentive. We're not doing nearly as much. And hence my conclusion, of course, technology matters. Of course, incentives matter, but don't overdo it. There was a bit of luck in this whole thing the U.S. had, and we used that luck. We produced it. Now, one other comment on this horizontal drilling. This is a plot from the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources. It's their summary of the average flow rate from a typical well in these tight oil formations as a function of time. And here's what you get the first year that you start that well. And basically, after 2 years, you're down to 15%, 1/6 of what you started. Now, it's not clear exactly what the options are here. Maybe you can refracture from that same well. Maybe you have to drill another one. But the point is, this is very expensive technology. It's not clear how long it's going to last. Could well be less than the traditional well. But this is what the people are so excited about. My position is, no, it doesn't change the long-run story. But as you know, that wasn't the end. The United States wasn't the only place you can drill for oil. We went to other locations, such as the North Sea. The North Sea accounted for essentially nothing of world total in 1970. Accounted for almost 9% of total world production in 1999. This is a graph of North Sea production. And you can see that has peaked and is now well into decline. It's today about half of where it was in 1999. Fortunately, the North Sea isn't the only place you can get oil. Here, for example, is Saudi Arabia on the top and the other members of OPEC on the bottom. Now, first thing I want to call your attention to is there are lots of ups and downs in these. And these are totally different from the ups and downs that I've been talking about in terms of the other countries. In my assessment, these have essentially nothing to do with exhaustion or depletion of mature fields. Instead, there are a series of geopolitical events that I'll talk about in a moment. Wars, for example, in the Middle East that lead to disruptions. And particularly in the case of Saudi Arabia, there is an intentional policy of trying to stabilize the market, cutting back their Saudi production a little bit when the market seems weak, increasing production in response to some of these geopolitical disturbances. That's what these ups and downs are about. And so for many years, the Saudis were the residual oil supplier in the market. And a lot of people were assuming they would continue to play that role. A lot of people were assuming that as, for example, the North Sea production declined and as demand from the emerging economies grew, that Saudi production would grow to take up the slack. Now, there are different claims about what's going on in Saudi Arabia. Some people say, well, their fields have been exploited for many, many years. Maybe they are finally facing the declining production rates. Others say, well, maybe the Saudis just didn't want to increase production. I don't have to get into that debate to claim that for whatever reason they didn't. That's a fact of life. Saudi production stopped increasing, hasn't been increasing, and that's going to be an important factor in the global totals I'll show you in just a moment. Now, there are other places. China, for example, is still on the way up. Although their three main fields are all clearly now in decline. They've been moving to other regions within China, managing to increase their production, not increase it nearly as fast as Chinese consumption is growing. Canadian production is growing. The oil sands are a factor in that. Although the oil sands are extremely capital intensive, that's not something that you can just multiply by 2 or 3 and think of it as ever being, a major part of world production, but it has been something increasing. And then outside of OPEC, there have been various success stories off the coast of Africa and Brazil and Central Asia. The broad trend there has been up. So put all this together. This is a graph now of the world total. This is a graph starting in 1973 with all of the individual countries that I just showed you, along with Mexico, I guess. And here's the US production we talked about. Here's the North Sea going up and down. Here's the world total. And basically, the world total increased from 1859 through 2005. Again, this same story. It's declining in some places, but there are new fields somewhere else to make up for it. But that story kind of changed here. Since 2005, it's been a tougher process to see that total increase. And that suggests, all of this suggests to me that we ought to be thinking about, okay, what if there is, in fact, a limit on what technology and incentives can do for us? what if we are facing a world where we're not going to be able to increase oil production significantly from where it is now, or maybe are even going to be talking about declines in outright production. And one way we can pose the question, or a question I'd like to look at now, is what would be the economic consequences if next year, say, we had to make do with 5% less oil being produced than is produced this year? What would that do to the economy, a 5% drop in production? Well, we don't have to be hypothetical about that question. I want to claim we've got a lot of historical experience with what would happen if we tried to make do with 5% less oil. Here, for example, is one. The Suez Crisis in 1956-57. So this is a summary, this black line, of how much oil production fell from the Middle East countries relative to the start of the crisis in 1956. And the graph is plotted here as a percent of total global production prior to the crisis. And you can see that was up to a 10% actual decline in production from Middle East countries associated with not just the closure of the Suez Canal, but also the sabotage and closure of some pipelines at the same time. In this blue graph, I've summarized, well, what was total world production? What happened to total world production? It turned out that during this episode, there was some excess capacity in the United States, among other places. And so there was some production that could come in just 4 months after the crisis started. That was replacing what was lost. So this blue line is the actual change in available oil, net of what was coming in from, net of what was lost from the Middle East. So here's, for example, an account from the New York Times in 1956. This is reporting some of what was observed to happen in Europe. Hotels were closed, factories were shut down, they banned Sunday driving, long lines in front of gas stations. Some stories we're sort of familiar with in later episodes that I'll be talking about, but it turned out we weren't the only ones to invent that kind of thing. Here's another example, another historical example you might look at for this. This is the OPEC oil embargo. Following the Arab-Israeli war in 1973, the Arab members of OPEC decided not to sell oil to certain countries they saw as sympathetic to Israel. And more importantly, they cut their production they'd sell to anybody. Here's the amount of the cut in production from the Arab members of OPEC, again described as a percent of the world total prior to the war. And the horizontal axis is months since the war began. The blue line, in this case, there was a little excess capacity outside of Arab OPEC, not much. That was the decline in world production. So that's another kind of episode we could look at. Well, what happened then to the economy? A couple other examples. The Iranian Revolution in the fall of 1978 led to the Shah having to leave Iran in January 1979. Here's the drop in production from Iran as a percent of the world total relative to where it had been in October 1978. That was a shock of maybe 7% of world production. In this case, there was some excess capacity to cushion some of that, the blue. Just to remind you, here's a quote from the New York Times now in 1979, talking about gasoline lines. I didn't show you some of those, same thing in 73, 74. Another example, the Iran-Iraq War. Very shortly after Iran got started getting its act together, it went to war with Iraq. Here's the drop in world production from the onset of the Iran-Iraq War. Here's the global. So that's another example we could look at. A final case study would be the first Persian Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. Here's the drop in production from Iraq and Kuwait as a percent of the world total. Here again, we had some excess capacity. Particularly important in this episode was Saudi Arabia. So we got 5 examples there. What happened? Well, after every one of those, the U.S. economy went into recession. Every 5 times out of 5. And as a matter of fact, we've had 11 recessions since World War II. And for 10 of those, there was some kind of spike up in oil prices prior to the recession. So the recessions are indicated here as the lighter shaded areas. Mark's now on the committee of the NBR that tells us exactly when those occur, and we take his word for it, so they're just plotted here. So here's the Arab members of OPEC embargo. This is the price of oil plotted on the vertical axis, starting here in 1971 through the present. So here's the OPEC embargo. Here's the price of oil shooting up in the Iranian Revolution, followed by a recession. Very shortly thereafter, we get another spike up from the Iran-Iraq War. That's followed by a recession. Here's the first Persian Gulf War, spike up, that's a recession. There's a spike up on oil prices here, which began as sort of correcting the big downturn in 1997. No major geopolitical event behind that, but that was also associated with a recession. And we also saw a big spike in the price of oil prior to the most recent recession. And I'll talk a little about what I think some of the role of oil prices may have been in that recession. So I think there's a prima facie case here. Gee, maybe this would do something to the economy. Maybe the economy would have trouble if we run this experiment again of seeing what would happen if we have to make do with 5% less oil, just from a purely empirical perspective. But let's take a look at what might be the mechanics behind it. So why would it matter? Why would it be affecting the economy? Well, here's one way you might try to think about that question from an economic point of view. It describes, say, total real GDP, Y, the total output of the economy, in terms of some production technology. How much we can produce, we're capable of producing as some function of K, our total capital stock that we've got, our equipment, and the total number of people we have working, and let's say energy. How much energy we have is perhaps a key determinant of what we can get out of our existing technology and out of our existing labor force. So suppose you thought there was some aggregate function like that, and you said, I'm interested in what would be the change in how much we could produce, Y, for a given change in energy that we use, E. Well, standard economic theory says that that derivative, the marginal product of energy, should be given by its relative price, the price of energy relative to the price of output. And the argument for this is, well, an individual firm could consider, I could buy a little more energy, I'd pay PE for it, I could get a little more output, I could sell Y, I could sell it for P. If the value of what I got was greater than the value of what I spent, I'd want to do it. The optimal purchases of energy would be the point where the marginal product of energy equals the relative price. Well, if you just take that equation, multiply both sides of the equation by E over Y, on the left we've got a percent change in Y for a given percent change in energy, an elasticity of output with respect to energy use. And on the right side we've got the price of energy times the amount of energy we use. That's the dollar value we're spending on energy relative to the price of output times total output, the dollar value of output. Left side is an elasticity of output with respect to energy use. The right side is a dollar share of energy in the total. Okay, so then if you get to this question, well, how much should the economy get kicked around if you change the price of energy? And suppose you said, well, at least over a short period of time, there's not going to be much change in our capital stock. We've still got the same equipment, so K is still the same. Suppose you said the total number of people working didn't change. So you said N is the same, K is the same. The only change I'm going to look at is going to operate through E alone here. And then you get that the elasticity of output with respect to the price of energy should be that first thing I talked about, elasticity of output with respect to energy use, times this thing. What's this? This is the percent change in energy used for a given percent change in the relative price. That's what we call the price elasticity of energy demand. Okay, so very simple theory I've sketched here says how much an oil price should kick around the economy should be basically the product of two things: an expenditure share. And the nice thing about this is very easy to measure. I can just look, how much money are we spending on energy? How big is that relative to the total dollar value of GDP? And I know that number. And I know it's a relatively small number, say something on the order of 5%, depending on how you define things. It's going to be the product of that with an elasticity, which is how much do I change my energy use when the price goes up? And we know that over the short run, that's a very small number. Maybe a number like 0.1, negative 0.1, something like that. Energy price goes up 10%. Okay, maybe I, over the short run, cut my energy use by 1%. Okay, so I'm going to take the product of something kind of small, like 5%, multiply by something maybe even smaller, like 0.1. I've got a pretty small effect. This shouldn't happen. The graph I just showed you shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been, but oil price went up by 50% or whatever it was. We just went into a recession. Shouldn't have happened if this was the mechanism. So maybe this wasn't the mechanism. Maybe that's not what's going on in that data. Well, are there other channels? Well, let's think about aggregate demand. There's an old tradition that says one of the things that happens in recessions is there's not enough spending overall. Although, for reasons I'll communicate, I also emphasize sectoral demand. Maybe it matters what kinds of things people are buying. So I'll just run through some simple calculations. Suppose, for example, that a typical consumer is spending, say, 5% of their budget on energy. And let's say that the energy price goes up by 20%. And suppose, as is the case for many consumers, that at least over the short run, a consumer is going to try to buy the same amount of energy. You're still going to take your car to the same gas station. You're still going to fill it up. You're still going to drive to work. Most consumers don't change their energy consumption, at least over the short run. Well, if you did that, you spent 5% of your budget on energy prices went up 20%, you're still trying to buy the same number of gallons of gasoline, you're going to have to cut something else by 1%. You're going to have to cut your spending on other items by say, 1%. Okay, so that just gives us kind of a ballpark for thinking about. What are the sizes of the effects we might see from this? Now, just one comment before I get into the data. We can use a number like that, but let me emphasize the experience of different consumers is very heterogeneous. So this is a plot of, in the red, it's your spending on energy, goods, and services as a percentage of your total spending. And in the blue, it's your spending on energy, goods, and services as a percent of your income. And it's broken down by the poorest 20% of Americans on the left and the richest 20% of Americans on the right. And the point is these are very different. It's a very different reality for different households. The poorer households are spending a very significant fraction of their total spending going to energy, goods, and services. It's less significant for the upper income. So it would be a more significant adjustment for some households than others. That's just one point I want you to bear in mind as we look at the more specific details. Okay, so with that as background, let's now look at the data. What do we see in the data in terms of the response of consumption spending to a change in energy prices? This particular diagram is adapted from a study by Lutz Kilian and a student of his, Edelstein, back in 2007. I'll call it an impulse response function for Mark, although the engineers may not like that terminology for this thing. Well, let me tell you what it is. So it's a simple forecasting model for trying to predict consumer spending as a function of lagged consumer spending and lagged energy prices. And it's the answer to the question for that forecasting model. Suppose I told you here at month 0 that energy prices go up. Consumers overall face higher energy prices at date 0. What would your model then predict for current consumption spending 1 month into the future, 2 months into the future, 3 months, and so on? And that prediction is here in the solid line. And this particular graph is normalized with an eye toward understanding that kind of mechanism I just talked about. Namely, it's normalized so that the size of the shock we're hitting the consumer with would amount for an average consumer to 1% of their spending. We raise energy prices at date 0 here such that if this consumer tried to buy the same physical quantity of energy, they'd have to cut back spending somewhere else by 1%. Okay? And it's a plot in percent of what happens to consumption. The black line is the prediction from the model. The blue lines are 95% confidence intervals. Okay, so now we all understand the graph. What's it say? It says when energy prices go up, consumers spend less on other stuff. Okay, not too surprising. It was a pretty basic theory. It's confirmed in the data. Okay, why am I showing you this? Well, there are a couple of things that are kind of interesting about it. One is the magnitude. I tried to explain this. We shocked the consumer budget by 1% of their purchasing power here at date 0, but they're actually cutting their spending by up to 2%. Why do you cut your spending by 2% if prices force you to spend 1% less? That's a little puzzling. The other thing is it takes some time for this to happen. We shocked their budget at time 0, but this effect is still playing out up to 6 months later. So in some ways it looks like exactly what you thought it should, but in other ways it doesn't. Some of the details are puzzling. So what's going on with that? Well, what Edelstein and Killian did was they said, all right, let's look at components of spending. What are they spending their money on? So here's a breakdown into the terms of the 3 main categories of consumer spending. We've got spending on services in the left, spending on non-durables in the middle, spending on durables in the right. These are all same scale, that is the percent decline. Here's how big the percent decline is in services, purchases. Here, non-durables. Here's durables. Okay, gee, it seems to be a particular category of spending. Durable goods, appliances, furniture, big ticket items, cars. Cars. Okay, here's motor vehicles in particular. This is not on the same scale. And here you see, oh, wow. There's an immediate hit to sales of U.S. automobiles following a shock to consumer budgets. Okay, once you see this graph, and so unlike that earlier thing, it's not really a delay. It starts to happen right away, and it's pretty big. And you realize, well, this isn't just an issue of consumers not having as much to spend. It's also an issue of they don't want to buy the same stuff. They don't want to buy these fuel-inefficient vehicles that they were buying last month because now they're facing a much higher energy cost. Now, to the extent that the auto industry, for example, has large fixed costs, this is a problem. You're selling cars and your sales fall 10%, 20%. You have a problem, a hit to your industry. There's loss of income in that sector. There's a loss of jobs. Those people then have less to spend on other goods. There's a secondary hit then to total demand. It's not just that consumers have less to spend after they pay for their gasoline. It's that the people who were making some of the primary things that consumers stop buying also have less money, and because it's not costless to move those workers and that capital to somewhere else, you have idle workers, idle capital. And of course, that's the main reason that whole production function calculation I did where I said capital doesn't change, labor doesn't change. No, in a recession, capital utilization falls, labor utilization, namely the employment rate, falls, and that's where the multipliers are coming from, and that's why it takes some time for it to happen. Okay, here's one other graph from Edelstein and Killian. This is consumer sentiment. So this University of Michigan survey where they asked people various questions about how optimistic they are. Same exercise. We hit consumers with a 1% shock to their purchasing power at date 0. And again, there's more or less a dramatic and immediate drop. And look at the units. This is like a 15 percentage point drop in this index. Very big thing. Consumers are really unhappy when this happens. And if you're especially one of the lower 40%, remembering what that meant, you were having trouble getting by this month no matter what happened, and all of a sudden it's a hit of this size. The 2% may not sound like a lot in terms of your income, but that 2% really was the difference between making it and not. Anyway, it's what we see in the data, big drop in consumer sentiment. And again, that drop in consumer sentiment is presumably translating into other spending. So this is my interpretation of the primary mechanism. It's not that we can't physically produce as much because energy is so vital. It's that it sets in motion changes in the level of spending and composition of spending, which then lead to further effects on the economy, so that it's a similar kind of recession to the sort of demand-driven recession people have always been thinking in terms of, but just having some specific contributory factors. Now, let's get back to that that basic fact I started with. I said world production more or less stagnating. Now here's a graph. This particular graph does include natural gas liquids. This is in millions of barrels per day produced globally. And so here's that basic plateau or stagnation that I was talking about, that I was suggesting basically did have as one of its explanatory factors, this depletion of mature fields that was catching up with us. Anyway, that's what happened to world production. Now, over this period, world real GDP increased. From 2005 to 2009 was up 17.2% logarithmically. So we know that the world economy can grow with stagnant oil. At least we did over that period. But you know, as an economist, suppose I told you that gee, world GDP went up 17%. What should have happened to oil demand? World GDP goes up 17%. Well, you'd say, any economist would say, gee, GDP goes up 17%, I think oil consumption would have gone up. I don't think it would have been stagnant. How much would oil consumption go up? Well, Mark's going to tell me, he wants to know the income elasticity of demand. What's the percentage change in energy consumption when income goes up by a certain percentage amount? So what is the income elasticity of oil demand? Well, it's different for different countries. For an advanced economy like the US, it might be like 0.5. Income goes up 1%. We increase our oil consumption, oil demand by say 0.5%, or at least we would if the price didn't change. For an emerging economy like China, it looks like the number's closer to 1. Chinese income goes up 1%. We might expect something like a 1% increase in consumption. Now, most of that growth globally was coming from the emerging economies rather than the US. Might suggest an elasticity closer to 1 than 0.5. Let me take 0.75 just for illustration. So this is an answer to a what-if question. What if the price of oil didn't change, but income did grow, and you had an income elasticity of 0.75 causing demand to go up with no price increase to choke it off? And so this is a graph actually that you come up with. This red line is basically just tracking the world GDP numbers. I just took those world GDP estimates, multiplied the change each year by 0.75, and that's what you get. That's what I call expected production here. The blue is the actual production. So we're talking about a shortfall by 2010 of something like 10 million barrels a day. Okay, well, that's not where we are. You aren't here on the red, you're here on the blue. Why are you on the blue? Because the price of oil didn't stay where it was in 2005. The price of oil had to go up to choke off that demand. How much does it have to go up? I could ask Mark again, and he would tell me, well, I'll tell you how much the price has to go up if you'll tell me what that price elasticity of demand is. Demand responds to income. That gave me the red line. Demand responds to price. So let me just do a sample calculation. If you assumed a short-run price elasticity of demand of 0.1, that's kind of a number I like for these ballpark things. It would say when the price of oil goes up 10%, you cut your, when the price of oil goes up 1%, say you cut your consumption by 10%. Well, if you do that and you ask, well, how much do I need to choke off demand by the amount we saw by 2010, you do a simple calculation. It says, well, price of oil should have gone to $147 a barrel. Now, obviously that kind of calculation is very sensitive to the elasticity. I might be comfortable with an elasticity of 0.1, though that's a short run. Give me more time and people will adjust. They'll buy different cars over time. We'll see more of a response. That 10% increase in energy prices, maybe I'd see a 2% drop, give me time to adjust. Okay, let's try an elasticity of 0.2. Then you say, well, the price of oil should have gone to about $86 a barrel. Now, if you said, well, maybe the short-run elasticity is like 0.1, and the longer-run elasticity is like 0.2, you'd say, what should have happened is the oil price should have gone to maybe $147 a barrel, and then by 2010 dropped back to, say, $86 a barrel, which is what happened. But it didn't happen in this nice, smooth fashion. I think a lot of people really did think that short-run elasticity was a little bit higher than 0.1. They were surprised that U.S. Consumption didn't drop more than it did in 2007 with the price increases. And so what you saw was that although these factors I've been talking about are very long run, I mean, I took you back to 1859 in terms of understanding what was going on, this price response was very rapid, and basically it was coming. A whole lot of this price increase came in late 2007, early 2008. My story is as the market was basically surprised that, hey, the price is over $100 a barrel and these guys are still buying this stuff. And so you saw this spike in oil prices that was kind of comparable to what we saw in these other episodes. What did we see happen to the U.S. economy? Well, we saw the auto sector got slaughtered. So here, for example, is sales of light trucks, includes the SUV category, manufactured in North America, plotted by month and different years represented by different colors if you want to see all the seasonal. What I'm calling your attention to here is 2008. The midst of that spike, late 2007, early 2008, and basically sales of SUVs started to tank by middle 2008. And just for perspective, remember that the Lehman Brothers collapse wasn't until September of this year. This is in July of 2008. The financial crisis was in September of 2008. But as of July, there was a big hit to the U.S. manufacturers of light trucks. Not so much cars, smaller vehicles. Here's the same thing. It wasn't so much car sales down. And in fact, if you look at imports, more fuel-efficient vehicles, they were actually up. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear this was a price-driven thing I'm talking about with the sales of the U.S. Vehicles as opposed to some kind of income or something precursor of the financial crisis or whatever. Here's employment in the automobile industry starting from July of 2007 in the blue line compared with July of 1990. 1990 was the first Persian Gulf War. I talked about the role of the auto sector in that important. Well, 2007, 2008 was a bigger hit to the auto sector than the first Persian Gulf War. So here's a plot. What I did here was to take those Edelstein-Killian relations that were estimated on data up through 2007, basically fitting the response to those historical oil shocks, responsive consumption, and there's several things plotted here. There's the actual path of consumption, that's this black line. So consumption growth slowed and then fell as we moved through that recession. The blue line is what the forecast of that model would have been if you didn't know anything past September of 2007. It's basically not a very brave model at that point, just extrapolating the trend. And the green line is the forecast of that relation fit to historical data. If you just let me tell that relation what's about to happen to energy prices. And basically it says, well, about half of that slowdown in consumption growth in the initial part of the recession, prior to the financial crisis, is exactly the magnitude of what you'd expect from this historical relation we saw before. Saying that, well, maybe oil prices were a contributing factor in that slowdown. Here in particular is motor vehicles. Same thing. The black line is the actual plot of motor vehicles. The blue line is the forecast you'd use from that historical relation if you don't know anything. The green line is basically the portion of that path you can explain just based on energy prices, and basically the initial downturn in autos seems primarily to be traceable to energy prices. Here's consumer sentiment. There was a big plunge in consumer sentiment. A fair part of the early downturn seems to be related to the oil prices. I won't talk about that. We won't get into that. So the bottom line is, now I don't want to sound crazy. I know, and everybody else knows, the financial crisis was the reason this was the Great Recession. It was what really turned it into a big problem. But prior to the financial crisis, the U.S. economy was running into problems. And those problems look quite a bit like what we saw in those other case studies. like what we saw when the U.S. economy had to deal with a sudden oil price increase coming from other kinds of explanations, except that in this case, I think it was really related to these long-run challenges. So my conclusion, my takeaway from this is that yes, we did see historical disruptions in the supply of oil, seem to have quite significant effects on the U.S. economy. But I think you have to interpret those effects as coming from what I call short-run cyclical effects. What I mean by that? I mean that the key things are underutilization of labor. It's not that we've lost people who could work. It's that we've lost jobs for them to be employed at. But we're not producing at the full capacity of the economy. And underutilization of capital. It's not that our factories don't work. It's not that we don't have energy to run the factories. It's that there isn't a demand for what that particular factory, namely SUV plant in Detroit, is specialized to make at the moment. And that's where you get these multipliers, both the multipliers over time and the multipliers in terms of the magnitude of the effect through these short-run cyclical effects. And that means that if we're thinking about the longer-run impact, this is a longer-run challenge, well, maybe we can take some comfort in those initial calculations I showed you that, well, we ought to be able to adapt. Give us time to change the kind of cars we drive, and so on. Maybe it is that value share that's the sort of number we should be looking at to answer this question instead of something that just really seems to derail the U.S. economy. That's the conclusion I draw from that. But let me close with this graph to point out to you. So this is a number I've been talking about off and on today. This is that expenditure share. This is just taking the spending consumers do on energy, goods, and services as a percentage of their total expending for the total spending for the overall U.S. economy. And this is that share as you plot it over time from 1960 through the present. And the point I want to emphasize about the graph is that that number isn't constant. It's a key parameter in any of these stories. A supply side story, a spending story, a key parameter is what's the dollar value of those energy inputs relative to the overall economy. It's a key parameter, but it's not constant. It goes way up in the OPEC oil embargo. It goes way up in the problems with Iran and Iraq. And it goes way up for exactly the reasons I was saying. These consumers are still trying to buy the same number of gallons of gasoline. The price has gone up. The share of their budget going to energy goes up quite a bit. And so, insofar as that's the case, I don't think we want to take full comfort in the fact, well, that number is only 6%. It's not a big deal for the economy. If we continue down this road of needing this resource, continual bidding for it from the emerging economies, the price goes up. With at least over the short run, we're going to see that value share increase. And then from any theory, this would become a more significant factor for the economy. So my bottom line is I worry more about these issues than a lot of economists. A lot of economists take considerable comfort. We've been okay for the last 150 years. We've found a way out of our problems. But as I look at the details of how we found our ways out of the problems, I'm not totally reassured by that. And in particular, I'm not talking here about the distant future, who knows what the future looks like. I'm talking about the last 10 years. I know what the last 10 years look like. I know we faced particular problems, and I just want to suggest that maybe we're going to have similar challenges like that for the next 10, next 20 years, and so on. So I guess I was told to stop here, so I will, and open it up for questions.
Is this on? Okay, so you talked about how people sort of react by eventually switching to more efficient cars and so on. How much potential is there for that in the economy, and how long does it take for us to take advantage of that?
Well, we're still in the middle of that process. So today, when most people buy a car to replace their old one, they're going to buy a more fuel-efficient vehicle. So we're still in that process. And so I think most projections are we could continue to see, for the next few years anyway, some ongoing declines. We have seen significant declines in U.S. consumption. I think we will see further declines. In addition to that, apart from that incentive, there is improving technology in automobile production each year. And historically, a lot of that increased efficiency of the engines has gone into making bigger cars, or making cars with more horsepower. That's where we've spent that technology dividend. Instead, we could have been devoting it to increasing fuel efficiency if that were a priority. So I think there is significant potential. I guess I didn't mention another detail of that IEA study. So they also said North America is going to be energy independent by 2020. Now, partly that's North America. They're counting Canada in this. I mentioned the U.S. numbers, 10 million barrels, less than we produced in 1970, even including these natural gas liquids. How do they get energy independence out of that? Well, they get energy independence out of that by assuming there's going to be an ongoing, very significant decline in U.S. consumption, seemingly extrapolating trends. And my view on that is, well, if that happens, it's not consistent with the scenario of the price of oil going back down to where it was. I think the price has been a key reason for that increase. So my answer is yes, there is certainly more potential, both of working through the process of the price we already have, and also in terms of incorporating new technology as it develops. And that potential is, in fact, the ultimate basis for this seemingly optimistic assessment, if any of you saw from this IEA release.
Hello. You mentioned, you talked a lot about the historical supply shocks to oil, but I wonder actually for the latest episode of oil price hike, many actually argued that it's related to demand from China or other emerging economy, or something related to financial market speculation and so on. So if you take sort of this demand argument, so if it's demand shock rather than the supply shock, actually the impact on the economy is rather very different, right? Instead of the shock to everyone in the economy, this might just be a distributional shock, right? Maybe people in the automobile industry is losing job, but on the other hand, industries that export to China will pick up jobs and so on, right? So I suppose sort of depends on your view about the nature of the shock. A lot of implications are very different.
Okay, well, I showed you the graph of total production. It was basically stagnant. I didn't talk about the detailed ways pointing out that actually during that same period that global production was not increasing, consumption of China alone was up about 1 million barrels a day. So how's that math work out? China's consuming another 1 million barrels every day. We're not producing anymore. What has to happen is that the consumption in places like the U.S. and Europe and Japan has to decrease. So in that sense, I really was saying, yes, it was this global demand confronting the fixed supply. I showed you that growth in world GDP. That's mostly China, India, not so much the U.S. and Europe and Japan. So, but as far as the specific point that weighs calling attention in the literature, yeah, some people say, and I've been among them, that it's a different effect on the economy, whether it's a demand shock or supply shock. My own interpretation of that is that if it's a gradual kind of thing, for which we do have time to adapt, it's a very different kind of set of dynamics we set in motion compared to this very rapid spike in the price like we saw. And moreover, if the nature of this slowly developing disturbance is good news economically, worldwide anyway, that's producing the growth in demand, that's a favorable economic development rather than unfavorable. But the way I think that this latest event ended up being damaging to the economy was that it didn't happen gradually. Instead, there was kind of this shock period from the fourth quarter of 2007 and the first 2 quarters of 2008, when it was a very rapid increase, comparable to the kind of increase in price we saw in these other episodes that were supply-based. I think that had the same effect. I showed you the actual path of consumer sentiment. Consumer sentiment tanked. All the dynamics we observed in the economy in that episode at that time, once it took on that character, were, I say, very similar, very parallel to what would be the case in these other episodes.
I want to thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I want to congratulate that you're an outstanding storyteller because you tell the entire story except you refuse to forecast, so you leave the audience to make the conclusion. Right? The forecast in the first part of your talk was the oil supplies are not going to go up very much, or they may stay level or come down soon. And you refused also to make a forecast in the second part of the talk, but if I put the two together, it looks pretty bleak.
Okay, well, then let me make a little effort of a forecast. There are two ways you could go. You could say, well, maybe the next decade will look like the last 150 years, and I told this very optimistic story for most of the last 150 years until we, or you could say the next decade will look like the last decade, the most recent. And what I think is the most likely outcome is the next decade will look like the last decade. I'm saying it looks to me like we've entered a new era. Now, notwithstanding, there are these longer run adjustments. We talked about the demand adjustments in consumption and the production adjustments. The shale oil is a big deal. It's going to help the U.S. economy over the interim. But I think people are making a big mistake when they look at these, look at the success in curtailing consumption and look at the success in production from these new fields and say, okay, we've solved that problem. We're back to that long run happy story. I'm not persuaded. So my forecast is the next decade will look like the last, meaning we'll see volatile prices. Oil prices could go up, could go down, could be quite significantly. And by the way, so I said the Middle East, we've got like 5 major episodes in recent memory when there was a war or something in the Middle East, significantly affected world supplies. I don't feel it's a brave forecast at all to tell you, well, we're going to see another one of those in the next decade. The next decade, I think we will see a major event in the Middle East, which will be like those first examples I talked about, and which may come in this context of a tougher situation globally, less excess capacity. So my prediction, I'm maybe not as alarmist as some who take this view that say we're just about to go off the cliff. It looks to me more like a bumpy plateau. We may see some near-term gains from these kind of expensive, hard things we're doing, but I think it's going to be a different kind of challenge than historically. So is that enough of a forecast, or am I still leaving some of the imagination of the reader for how this ends? Yeah, Rob.
Okay, so the U.S. has a very low tax on the consumer confronts when they consume oil products. Europeans, other countries, not all, but many, have a very high tax, which should insulate them more from a shock of the crude product, the crude resource. So you would be predicting that there'd be a substantially less impact of an oil price rise on the economies in developing in other industrialized countries. Correct?
Correct, and not only that, I think the U.S. auto industry is kind of unique among the world in this particular reliance on the less fuel-efficient vehicles. So there's a particular vulnerability of the U.S. economy for that reason as well. And I think that's borne out in the data as well.
I was going to ask about that. And the other question I was wondering is, what else has this kind of shock phenomenon? What other markets do? I guess food does in some parts of the world, right? You see a sudden spike in the price of corn or something like that. And have you tried to see whether this view of how shocks ripple through an economy works for other things?
Well, with food, you want to be careful how you're defining it. I mean, there are different ways you can get your calories. Wolfram Schlenker has an interesting study where he thinks about the 4 main grain crops in terms of the total calories produced, from those, and that's kind of a meaningful aggregate for talking about the people in the world at a subsistence level. And you get somewhere with that. I think if you're looking at like the U.S. economy, you know, food prices, I think it's there's enough substitution possibility there. It's this lack of a substitution opportunity that I think is really the key to this mechanism I've been talking about for the U.S. And it's the fact that we did have some disposable income we were spending on these big ticket items that we can see these multipliers. So I'm not sure if there is another good example like this. There's some special things about oil.
Last question.
So in terms of, in response to the oil shock, there were some policies that various governments implemented, like monetary policy, for example. Can you talk about like what U.S. did versus other countries and what was a better policy or worse?
Well, Mark and I have an exchange about this question in the literature as well. If you think I've got the story right here, there is limited potential for monetary policy insofar as I'm emphasizing not just the overall level of spending, but also the composition of spending. It's a fact of life that given what has happened physically in the Middle East, for example, we're not going to want to be producing those kind of cars at the moment. It's a fact of life that we've sunk the capital, specialized physical capital, human capital into producing those kind of cars. It's a fact of life we're going to take a hit as a result. And you can't wiggle your way out of it, in my view, by doing something with monetary policy. And so in that respect, it is like a real shock. I mean, these were real things. The world didn't have the oil to consume. So my view is that the ability of monetary policy to mitigate this particular mechanism is more limited than some other economists conclude. I don't think it is monetary policy that's the key to this response.
Okay, with that, let's thank Professor Hamilton for a beautiful talk. And please join us for a reception outside.